I'm Rob van Duin. I'm head of the Office of Studium Generale and organizer of this evening. I will also be the moderator when we start the discussion. But before we start a discussion on LGBTIQA+ activism, we first have a lecture, and this is an historical lecture with the title Scapegoats and Sodomites, Repression and Perception of Sodomy in the Southern Netherlands, starting in the Middle Ages. But also at the end, we're trying to look at present times and see if things in earlier ages maybe are still the same, or what has changed, or what in cultural sense is the same when it comes to these issues. Joining after the lecture, we have three people, two of Maastricht University, or UM Pride actually, so two students studying at Maastricht University from the queer community here in Maastricht, and Sorab Roussayar, who's from Amsterdam and very active in the queer community there, and also in the Netherlands active. So actually first we could start with Jonas Roelens. He is an historian with a focus on history of deviant sexuality to the late medieval and early modern period. His PhD on sodomy to the Southern Netherlands was awarded with the Erik Duvinger Prize and the PhD Cup in 2019. He teaches gender history at Ghent University, and he's co-author of a book in Dutch on the history of homosexuality in Belgium, and is currently working on a new book that discusses Belgian art history from a queer perspective. Please welcome Jonas Roelens.
Thank you, Rob, for this lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here. What strikes me every time when I talk to a Dutch audience is at 8 p.m. sharp, when things are supposed to start, there's a sacred silence in the audience. Flemings and Belgians keep babbling away until you have to grab their attention, but you were very attentive. Thank you very much. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to talk about the repression and perception of sodomy in the medieval period, the early modern period. But I'm going to focus on dynamics of that repression that can also be interesting, relevant to our present society. We're going to look at how the figure of the Sodomite was used as a scapegoat during political, cultural, economic processes. But first things first, what are we talking about when we're talking about sodomy? It's a biblical term which is derived from the ancient Testament. The biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destructed by God with fire and brimstone and a whole array of other biblical punishments, because the male inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were engaging in same-sex acts and anal intercourse, and God was not too pleased about that, and so he decided to wipe away those cities from the earth. During medieval periods, that term, sodomy, became a sort of umbrella term designed to delineate a whole range of sexual acts. Sexual acts that we, in our 21st century, no longer associate with one another. The common demeanor between all those sexual acts were that they were not aimed at procreation. So, for instance, masturbation, child abuse, bestiality, anal intercourse between a man and a woman, but first and foremost, homosexual acts, same-sex acts, were associated with sodomy. So nowadays we don't associate bestiality or sex with animals with homoerotic acts. So you see that there's a whole evolution in the thinking about norms, the thinking about taboos. This is the picture on the left. By any coincidence, is in fact a chalk drawing from a mine not very far from Maastricht from the early 15th century. So There you see a man who is doing some things with his dog that you're not supposed to do, and that illustrates how people thought about bestiality, thought about sodomy, and perceived it as very dangerous. Because on the right you see a sort of half pig, half man that was supposedly born in Brussels in the 16th century and was the result of a farmer who had a bit of fun in his stable. So you weren't supposed to have sex with those animals. But first and foremost, it was associated with male same-sex acts, and it was a very large taboo in that medieval society because sodomy was punished through death, by death through fire, especially in our regions, especially in the Netherlands. That's a very public crime with a lot of upheaval and processions and etc. But at the main time, it was also a taboo. It was called in Latin a crimen nefandum, the Voldemort of all crimes, something that should not be mentioned. And we have a whole array of biblical texts, legal texts, in which authors warn one another not to talk about it. So you have this chapter in a sort of theological tract that goes, I'm very sorry, dear reader, I know this is a huge taboo, we shouldn't talk about it, please don't talk about it any further, I'm going to be very brief, but here's this thing called sodomy. But don't mention it again, because your tongue will fall out and the air will smell bad around you if you even talk about it. So it's really a taboo, an unmentionable vice. Which makes it a very difficult aspect or topic to discuss or study, but that's what I've been doing the past few years, and I have researched for the southern Netherlands, so more or less present-day Belgium, and what cities this was prosecuted, how many people were prosecuted, if there were peaks and valleys in that prosecution, and what triggers that prosecution. Why do certain cities in a certain given time feel the need to prosecute those sodomites? And I've been doing that for the following cities, and I warn you, this is the most dynamic part of my slides because I'm very bad at PowerPoint. Oh, here we are. So these are a number of cities like Bruges, Ghent, nowadays famous for chocolate and beer, but very important cities in the Middle Ages, Antwerp, Brussels, etc., etc. These are the numbers. Please bear in mind that this is now a very neat graph, but it took me months and months in the archives, blood, sweat, and tears, that it's not represented in those numbers. Here you have the number of the list of cities, the trials, the number of accusations, the executions, and the mortality rate. And you have to believe me, the total mortality rate is 62%. It's cut off as a sort of cliffhanger, so to speak, but here we are. Those are huge numbers. If you look at the more famous court of the Spanish Inquisition, which is a name that is far more famous. Monty Python sketches were built around the Spanish Inquisition, etc. The mortality rate in those in that court is 10%, whereas these courts in the southern Netherlands have a mortality rate of 60%, which goes to show that the willingness to prosecute those sodomites was very high at the time. Why do we have more people accused than there are trials? Because a lot of people were tried during group trials. One person is caught in the act, is interrogated during torture, and spits out a whole list of other names of people who have been doing the same sort of stuff. There's a huge variety or a huge difference between those cities. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. You see that, for instance, Bruges is responsible for nearly half of those executions, but we'll come to that in a minute. I've done a number of things to understand why those cities, why those people felt it so necessary to prosecute that. So I've also been looking beyond legal files. I've also been looking at chronicles, music, song texts, diaries, etc., to find out which stereotypes people used to describe those sodomites, to justificate that repression. We'll see that there's great dominance on religious discourse. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is repeated over and over and over again because people fear that there is something like a divine retaliation. The whole concept of God intervening in biblical times is very alive and kicking in the Middle Ages. The idea that God could intervene once more is alive and kicking. And so Sodom and Gomorrah is omnipresent, whether it's in art like this by Joachim Patinier, or in song texts, in texts discussing the Ten Commandments, etc. It's everywhere. Not just in religious texts, but also in legislation and in legal tracts. When you have lawyers, scholars, people who have gone to universities, who are busy professionally with law, they too refer to the Bible and to that divine retaliation to justify why those people should be punished. I'm not going, I could show you dozens and dozens of images that justify this, but here's are a few examples of that divine retaliation and that religious discourse. For instance, this is a medieval Bible which shows Adam and Eve in the during the fall of mankind. Eve is seducing Adam to bite from the apple, and in the lower part you see two couples of men engaging in sexual intercourse as being stimulated by the devil, and so they are linked with one another. As Eve was responsible for the fall of mankind, Sodomites in our present time are once again responsible for those sins. The right example is from Dante's Divine Comedy, which illustrates that Sodomites were condemned to a certain circle of hell. Also a bit closer by is Hieronymus Bosch, which is very often interpreted as a sort of humorous painter who just depicts funny creatures without message whatsoever, but he's rather a moralist. His tableaus, his paintings are really meant to transport a message, a moralizing message to his viewers, which is also true for the Garden of Earthly Delights, perhaps his most famous painting. In the left panel you see the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, everything's clear, everything's fine. But in the central panel you see how people, our present day society so to speak, has turned into a hellhole in which people dance and drink and enjoy fruit, symbols of vanity, symbols of sin. And in the right panel, we get our just punishment. We end up in hell, where every group of sinners is attributed to the specific punishment. Interestingly enough, Bosch also includes Sodomites in his painting. He refers rather graphically, rather explicitly, according to medieval norms, he refers to anal sexuality, which is considered the most heinous crime of those Sodomites. They interfere with the divine hierarchy. They mess up the society as God had intended it. This is a Dutch piece of one of those legal texts written by a humanist, someone who is considered a Renaissance thinker from Bruges, Joost de Damhouder, and he has written a sort of manual for courts, for judges, because in the Middle Ages you didn't have the division of power, so people who were sitting in the city, in the local city courts, civic aldermen, were also the judges. Most of them didn't have formal training. They didn't know much about law. And so Joost wrote a manual, not in Latin, but in Dutch, so that these people could understand how they should punish particular crimes. A sort of IKEA guidebook. If you want to build a table, this step, this step. If you want to sentence a murderer, this step, this step. More or less the same. When he writes about why sodomy should be punished, he too, this humanist, this Renaissance man, refers to the Bible. And for this horrible and oppressive sins is sent to mankind pestilence, war, earthquakes, floods, and far more other plagues. The idea that an individual, an individual choice, because this I perhaps should clarify or stress. In medieval period, they didn't have a concept like a sexual orientation. Every person could choose to engage in correct sex or could choose to engage in wrong sex. So it was your personal responsibility to stay on the right track. If you, however, chose to engage in unnatural sex, you were not only risking your own soul, you're also risking the danger or the existence of your society, because God would interfere again, would strike again, would punish your society. And much like in biblical times, where Sodom was wiped away from the earth without saving women or children, this would happen again. So societies as a whole were in danger because of those individuals. That idea was very much repeated time and time again. That does not mean, however, that in that region, where that belief was very much alive, that those prosecutions were constant. Even in those southern Netherlands, there were peaks and dips in that urban prosecution. One of the very first, in Europe in fact, one of the very first executions took place in my hometown in Ghent in 1292, but the real peak only emerges in the 15th century. So what I've been doing is, in my own research, I've looked at all those court records for over 300 years, between 1400 and 1700, and you see that there's a peak for almost 75 years, between 1450 and 1525. Afterwards, they slowly diminish. During the 17th century, from the 1600s onwards, we hardly find any trials at all. So there's, in those 300 years, a period in which there is a sort of tolerance, or in which the willingness to prosecute people isn't that large. And then there's this sort of momentum in which a number of cities find it very necessary to prosecute that crime. Here you see that graph where it goes to show that from the 1450s onwards there's a huge peak, and then only isolated cases from the 17th century onwards. Why is that? And how could we explain that? And is that region an unique region? Due to time, I'm going to be brief about it, but as a matter of fact, we see that there is a sort of Mediterranean model. Southern Europe, particularly Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, has the sort of same chronology. From the 15th, 16th century onwards, there's a peak. In other regions, like Scandinavia, present-day Germany, England, also this region, the Northern Netherlands or the Dutch Republic, prosecutions start way more centuries later, only in the 18th century. So you could say that present-day Belgium, the Southern Netherlands, follows more or less the Mediterranean model, and is moreover one of the most active regions. Above the Alps, north of the Alps, there is no region that has prosecuted more Sodomites during the Middle Ages than the Southern Netherlands. Looking at the time, why is that? There's one exception. One exception rather. Italy, particularly the city of Florence, was widely associated with sodomy in the Middle Ages. In contemporary German, if you wanted to scold someone, you just had to say, "Du bist ein Florenzer." You're a citizen from Florence, and that was basically the same as saying you're a fag, you're gay, you're a sissy. Everyone understood what you were saying because Florence was widely associated with that particular type of sin. They had a very specific way of dealing with that crime as well. They considered it not as a sin, not as rather a social problem. They understood that when teenage boys grew up and they weren't, they couldn't start their own family because they were lacking the social means, the financial means. They were being horny and they were just trying some things out with their friends, etc. It was a sort of rite de passage. You could gain some sexual experience with other boys, with other men during your youth. It wasn't that big a deal. When you grew up, you need to let go. So no sexual orientation as well. Some sort of phase in life. They were just fined financially. They weren't executed like in other regions. That changed during a particular moment in history when a certain monk, Savonarola, took power. What was he saying? And that's something we're going to see in a number of cases. He said, well, there's a crisis in our town. Our city is in crisis. We aren't striving as much as we used to, and that's because we've been too tolerant towards those Sodomites. From church, he predicted a whole number of horrifices. He would say that the Pope will die, France will invade, etc., etc., and that's all because we've been too tolerant towards those Sodomites. He starts a sort of religious republic in which he starts to condemn those Sodomites more fiercely. He uses that minority to start his own political system, so to speak. That doesn't last very long because he too, in the end, ends up at the stake. That's the irony of history, I suppose. But back to the Netherlands, and perhaps back to this region, the northern Netherlands, where you can more or less see the same dynamics. In the Middle Ages, there are very few executions. I listed some of the cities for you here. I don't have any numbers on Maastricht, but you see that Haarlem, Amsterdam, during that 15th, 16th century, Amsterdam doesn't have a single one. Also in later periods, up until the 1700s, not so much. What changes here is in the 18th century. That's perhaps a known story for the most of you. In the 1730s, the city of Utrecht arrests some Sodomites. Some men who were having sex in the Dome Church, in the tower more specifically. Whilst enjoying the panoramic view, they were also enjoying one another, I suppose. But they were caught in the act, they were arrested, and they were starting to spit out names. Well, we also know some Sodomites, not only in Utrecht, but also in Amsterdam, for instance. And those civic authorities in several cities started to cooperate, started to arrest those people. And in a few years, 1713, 1733, 350 convictions took place. The idea was very much alive that at this particular point too, the Republic was in crisis. The 17th century, the so-called golden century, which is a problematic term in its own, but that's another discussion, was over. The idea of Rembrandt and Amsterdam and the VOC, that had been something from the past. The Republic was economically bleeding. And the idea took hold over themselves that this was due to those Sodomites. In the 1730s, a sort of worm was discovered, which threatened to which threatened to perish the dikes, the wooden infrastructure to protect the land from the invading sea. A punishment from God, because we have been too tolerant towards those Sodomites. And a number of executions took place, and these are actually very interesting sources. These are leaflets with song texts on them. You could buy them if you were going to witness an execution as a souvenir, or much like a football match nowadays. And you could sing along with those songs while you were witnessing an execution. A sort of purifying ritual to cleanse society. And here another depiction of those trials in the 1730s. Truth reveals the subculture, reveals the underground network that is threatening our beloved nation. And in the background you see the divine flames coming down on the land, much like in biblical times, much like with Sodom and Gomorrah. Back to the southern Netherlands to show that these same dynamics were at work here as well. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that city on the first line, Bruges, with 79 accusations and 113 executions. A high mortality rate as well, 63%. Why is that? I'm going to talk about scapegoating. One of the possible explanations to explain why cities, regions feel the need to prosecute minorities. The scapegoat theory is not a theory I came up with myself, but is anthropological and has been used for historical means by Robert Moore, who wrote The Persecuting Society. a book from the 80s in which he claims that societies in distress with social upheaval need a minority, need a scapegoat to demonize, to banish from society, to show that the authorities are still working towards a solution, marginalizing social undesirables as an outlet, as a catharsis moment. And we see that through the centuries, we have witnessed a number of those minority groups. In the 14th century, for instance, you had a rise of anti-Semitism because a lot of stories were circulating that the Jewish community stole hosts and desecrated them to mock Christian faith. That they murdered or kidnapped children, murdered them ritually, used their blood in sort of satanic rituals. That they spread plague, that they tried to root out, that they tried to kill Christians. All of these stories are totally untrue, naturally, but they had very concrete consequences, because in the Netherlands we see pogroms in Brussels, in Louvain, in other regions as well, with hundreds of people dying at the stake. They were so successfully that when the 15th century enters, there were hardly any Jews left in the southern Netherlands. And as a consequence, they start to look for another group, which are those Sodomites. And in the 16th century, we see that heretics, Protestants are being replaced. Another scapegoat enters the scene, especially when the Emperor Charles V asks for a strong persecution. 17th century, we see that witchcraft enters the scene. All of a sudden, those heretics are more or less the Protestants have found their place in society. Up, another minority group is targeted. Now it's women, mostly because 80% of the witches prosecuted in early modern Europe were women that were being executed. The Netherlands were not a marginal region in that prosecution. It's very difficult to put numbers on that phenomenon, but recent estimations go to show that 2,800 up until 3,900 women people were executed in the Netherlands. Once again, it declines afterwards. So you see that there are a number of groups: 14th century Jews, 15th century Sodomites, 16th century heretics, 17th century witches. Reality is a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex, but this scheme is very useful to see the bigger picture. Why sodomy in the 15th century? I think, and that's my own theory, so you can disagree with that and we can discuss about it, but in the 15th century, religion starts to gain traction, becomes very important in the organization of urban life. Historians have called this civic morality, urban religion, in which there's a new moral climate in which the unity of the city is being stressed, is being sanctioned, and is being expressed through religious rituals. It's the highlight, it's at this point, religious ceremonies and parades around town are reaching their height and are used to create a sense of unity. Remember the biblical story in which one sodomite or in which one individual is responsible for the decline of an entire society. Sodomites are sinful because they threaten not just themselves, but the entire society, the entire city in which they live. 15th century people are very aware of that idea, are very keen on protecting their urban society. And so, according to me, sodomy is the ideal, sodomites are the ideal scapegoat in that period. Let's talk about Bruges. Why are people in Bruges so keen on prosecuting people? The high number is not only because there are more people living in Bruges. That would make sense. If you're living in a large city, you will have more executions than if you're living in a very small rural community. But if you compare those executions per 1,000 inhabitants, for instance, you see that the prosecution rate still stands out. Compared to a city like Antwerp, for instance, which has a more or less comparable number of inhabitants, they have a total different organization. Why is that? I think that in the southern Netherlands too, you see that scapegoating. You see that Bruges, which is called in my dissertation the Sodom of the North, which is a pun because the touristic brochures on Bruges always call themselves the Venice of the North to attract tourists to buy chocolates, etc. Well, I call them the Sodom of the North, and that's also known among contemporaries. You see a number of infights, pub fights, in which people from other cities scold people from Bruges. You from Bruges, you're all buggers. And bugger is a word to denote Sodomites. Comes from Bulgaria in Latin, because people believe that Bulgaria is the source of all sorts of heresy and sexual crimes, but another story. Why is Bruges so keen on prosecuting Sodomites? Why have they so much more executions and trials than any other city in the region? It's a very unstable city at the end of the 15th century. It has been an economic metropole, it has been a political center, but it's losing that situation. At the end of the 15th century, Bruges is the scene of a number of political crises. It plays the leading role in opposing the Burgundian dukes, the prince of the region who tries to gain all the power. Those cities oppose that power, and Bruges often takes the leading role. A possible explanation could be that very same Burgundian duke, the city authorities want to show the people that they are still in control, that they take a minority and execute them to show all that townsfolk try to rebel, don't rebel because we have power. We can kill you, we kill those minorities, we kill those sodomites, so be quiet. Then again, in itself that's not enough, because the political situation in Bruges is not unique. A range of cities rebel against the dukes. Another possible explanation is demographic. Black Death, the plague, which we already saw in the 14th century, killed a number of people. A high number of people. In some regions, 1 out of 3 people died. And once again, this caused panic. This illustrated the sense that this was a punishment of God. We have been too tolerant towards Sodomites. This is perhaps a punishment from God. In a number of Italian cities, we see that every time plague enters, the number of executions or the number of trials peaks. People want to find a solution for their problem, so they reach towards a minority to reach that goal. Bruges was hit by the plague as well, but so were a number of other cities in the region. So once again, this in itself won't suffice as an answer. There was also a huge economic crisis at the end of the 15th century. Bruges had been an economic hub for centuries, but was losing that position. Due to climate change, actually. A very common topic in our society as well. They had the direct access to the sea, the Zwin estuary, but that was diminishing because the sea tide was changing, etc. So the boats couldn't reach Bruges as swiftly as they used to do in the past. So the tradesmen moved to other cities. Moved to Breda, moved to 's-Hertogenbosch, moved to Antwerp. The city was losing its money, was losing its prosperity, and were looking for a minority to explain that whole changing situation. So in my hypothesis, the combination of political upheaval, demographic crisis, and economic decline created a sort of general moral réveil, a need to prosecute minorities. Due to time, I'm not going to talk in general or in length about the different social profiles of those people prosecuted, but they reveal a number of things. Sodomites were huge sinners. They created, or they went against the divine order. They needed to be banned or burned at the stake. We see that the social profile of those people did, however, have an impact on their trials. The more wealthy you were, the more rich you were, the more successful you could plead your cause, and the higher your chances were to escape scot-free, to make sure that you weren't convicted. We see that people from the middle class, who had citizenship, who had an honorable occupation, who were married, who had goods, who had means of their own, could often plead their innocence, could pay a small fine, and were released without further ado. Noblemen had the same issue. They could say, well, you're not, I'm a nobleman, you can't convict me, etc., etc. And in many cases, they succeeded. Sorry. Better like that. Another group that was very privileged was the clergy. They were, of course, responsible for that whole religious condemnation, but when clergymen, priests, monks themselves were caught or were accused of sodomy, they could just go to their own courts, to the ecclesiastical court, and they just received a small fine or a few days in jail, and they were released once again. They had a very bad reputation for sodomy in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. They too were used in a sort of propagandic war. When the Reformation took place, when Luther and Calvin tried to convince everyone from joining their flock and abandoning the Roman Catholic Church, they used that reputation of Catholic priests and monks being sodomites. Luther in particular wrote a number of treatises on priests being very bad people. Wie das Papsttum zu Rom vom Teufel gestiftet. The Pope in Rome is a devil, and he has he commits sodomy with all his cardinals and a number of young boys in the Sistine Chapel, etc., etc. We see that this is used in the Netherlands as well, and during the 80 Years' War, during the Dutch uprising, a very complex conflict, which I won't go all too deep in. We see that sodomy is being used as well. In Ghent, in Bruges, you also have Calvinists who take power, who replace the Catholic aldermen, and who found or start a sort of Calvinist republic. They are being opposed by mendicants, the Augustinian friars, the Franciscan friars, etc., etc. So there's a cultural war in those cities, and the newly founded Calvinist city councils use sodomy as a sort of way of shutting them up. They start to condemn those monks for sodomy. You have been having sex with one another in your convent and your convents. They arrest people, they torture them until they admit that they were doing such stuff, and they burn them or they banish them on the stake. A way of showing, don't go to the Catholic Church, join the Protestant communion. They are, I don't know if you can see that, yeah. A huge propagandic show trial is being released. This is TikTok from the 16th century. This is a newsprint made by the most famous printmaker in its day, Frans Hogenberg, and it's printed and distributed all across Europe. It's being reprinted in a number of languages, etc. And what you see how these monks, those deviant monks, are being arrested and being burned at the stake. And at the back of the picture, you see how these three monks are actually standing at the stake, ready to be burnt. And in the front of the picture, you see how some other monks are being whipped with rods until their backs are bleeding, and how their hair is being turned or burnt with an I don't know if this thing, yeah. Here we are. How their hair is being burned off with an iron that was being heated in the fire. And some monks are being banished here outside of the city. Huge show trial, and these newsprints were being redistributed a number of languages up until the 17th century. Sodomites are being used to propagate ideas. This is also true when foreigners are being included. We see that in a lot of medieval societies try to evoke sodomy as a foreign concept, something that is not present in our current society. Sodomy, sir? Never heard of. Must be something foreign. We don't do these things over here. We're clean, we're pure. If this is occurring in our city, some filthy foreigner must have introduced it over here. That's the main gist when medieval people think about sodomy, which makes migrants extra vulnerable for accusations. In a number of European regions, we see that migrants are overrepresented. They are more easily accused by the local community because they are mistrusted. We see that foreigners are being used in propagandic images. Here, for instance, in the Middle Ages, but also in the early modern period, it was very common to depict Islam and Muslims as being very fond of sodomy. Foreigners who were traveling to Jerusalem and the Holy Land past Islamic cities, and they came back and wrote stories about how they saw Muslim people engaging in sodomy. Once again, we are good, they are bad. It's us versus, it's the West versus the rest, so to speak. Here you see the picture of the story of Saint Pelagius, a young boy who was being captured by the Caliph of Cordoba. The Caliph wanted to have sex with him. Of course, the holy boy refused, and he was being tortured to death. And that was a sort of the look how devout Christians are, and look how corrupt Muslims are, because they want to have sodomy all day long. Same with the sort of conquistadores who invaded the Americas. They said that they were doing the just thing. Why? Because the Native Americans were nothing but Sodomites, and they needed to be Christianized. They needed to be learned how their ways were so backwards. And here you see Native Americans that are being ripped apart by dogs because they were Sodomites, because they were called hermaphrodites, what we would call intersex people nowadays. So once again, minorities used in a propagandic way. Not going to talk about that, not about that as well. I'm going to talk about urban discourses, because it's not a top-down issue. We have talked about authorities and judges and lawyers. It's also something that people in an urban community use for their own benefit. People use gossip, people use slurs, people use each other's social reputation to convict one another. If you are a baker and you have another baker in your street and his bread is a bit more cheap and perhaps a bit better than yours and you're going bankrupt, the most easy thing to do in medieval times is to call your economic rival a sodomite. Start a slur about him. And in so many cases you're lucky and that person is being accused and perhaps convicted. So people use it in their own benefit. I actually found a number of cases in which women who were married to a man and they were fed up with their man started accusing them of sodomy, so that he would end up at the stake and they could start a new life with their lover. When those women were being discovered and then they had to confess that those accusations were fake, they ended up at the scaffold. But it goes to show that the so-called unspeakable sin was a hot topic in urban communities, and they too used it to scapegoat one another. Politicians use it as well, something very similar to our society. If you don't agree with a politician, spread some rumors about their private lives and their political beliefs are untrustworthy. We see a number of people who are being accused, whether it's knights, popes, kings, etc. A whole list of people had to defend themselves against allegations of sodomy. Also, our own Burgundian Duke, Charles the Bold, they were plotting a murder against him. Some of his noblemen weren't so pleased with him, so they tried to kill him. And they had written a letter in which they were looking for other people to join their group, but the letter was discovered, and so they fled to Paris. And as an explanation of why they had fled to Paris, they said, well, we didn't fled because of that murder complot. No. We fled because Charles the Bold was constantly trying to seduce us. He was wanting to have sex with us. He did things so large that a single word written about him would contaminate the air. The abominations that he was trying to do with us are against the divine and natural order. So once again, the idea of if you're not agreeing with a politician, a leader, just slur them as sodomites. Urban discourses are very useful. We see that the legal system is very slow. A last example from Bruges, Antonis Camelin, who was arrested for a fact that he had committed 12 years before. Antonis Camelin heeft verkend, has confessed that within 12 years he had committed with several persons on several places the horrible species of the unnameable, the unhuman sin of sodomy. Why are they arresting him for something he did 12 years before? Probably because he was snitched. Probably because some people in his local community felt the need to hand him over to the authorities. So we see a number of things in that medieval society that, to sum up, are very relevant to our society today, I think. We see that prosecution in that dark, barbaric times, as we often think as the Middle Ages, is not consequent. We see that there are peaks and valleys. We see that there are times in which prosecution is very willing, that people are very willing to prosecute, and we see that there are periods in which it's not so much of a priority. We see that that priority becomes larger in times of crisis, in times of economic and political difficulties. We see that minorities are being, several groups of minorities are being depicted in a sort of propagandic way to attract a certain message, to spread one's message. Whether it's Calvinists versus Catholics, whether it's conquistadores trying to defend their barbaric ways in the Americas, whether it's a nation that is facing economic decline, it's very often that this sexual minority is used as a scapegoat. And I think that in these times in which we live with a lot of political conflicts, groups that no longer talk to one another, we see that minorities are once again used as scapegoats in a very complex but very cynical political game. And it goes to show that these medieval dynamics can still be relevant to our society today. So that was, in a nutshell, what I tried to do. I think it's time for the talk or debate now. If there are any questions, you can ask them, I guess, and otherwise I will be here to answer them later in the evening. Thanks for now, and I'd like to join the others on stage.
Thank you, Jonas. Indeed, way back, but if we do look at some things you pointed out, I think we can relate them to present issues, and that's what we're actually going to talk about now. So it's more about LGBTQIA+ activism now, and I want to ask the other guests to join us. Oops, sorry. So first, it is important to know that this whole idea of this evening started with a discussion at the center, the historical center, social historical center of Limburg, here because there's an exhibition of COC in Centre Céomique at this point, about 50 years of existence of COC in Limburg, and COC is the Dutch organization that fights for the rights of LGBTIQA+ people. And also good to know that when I thought about this, okay, can we get an historical view of 50 years COC in Limburg, or what is actually the present issue nowadays when we look at activism? And I think as a homosexual from another generation who grew up in the 70s and came out in the 80s, I have a whole different view from about this activism of nowadays, and I'm very interested in looking at what it is. Is there a difference from now and 30 years ago? And what are the discussion points now? We've come far with a lot of rights for gay and lesbian people, also transgender people. Although we see some backlashes at this moment in the United States, maybe also in the light of what we just heard, we see that there's a lot of scapegoats issues now. So that was my personal idea about, okay, let's just get this discussion on this queer activism today and see if there are indeed differences. So to start with, we have here at the table Charity Plechowska. She's a student at Maastricht Science Program, and she's a board member of UN Pride. Can you explain a little bit what UN Pride is, or what it is for you? Turn on. Yes.
Yes, so first of all, I use they, them pronouns.
Yes, sorry.
And UN Pride is basically our university-wide organization that's committed to bringing queer community in our university together. We organize different social events, different ways that queer people in the university can meet one another and create long-lasting friendships. But also we have active A&R Academia and Research Committee that's also supposed to extend our knowledge about queer situations and basically support any queer research that we find interesting. We had plans like symposium on very different events of that nature. So yeah, essentially we're more of the trying to build the social fabric of queer community and also support research and knowledge about our community.
Yeah, thank you for that, Charity. Then Juan Roman Mara Barrios, you're doing this Master in Public Health at Maastricht University, and you're an LGBTQI healthcare advocate who worked with LGBTQ plus advocacy groups in the US and Latin America. Can you explain a little bit what that means or what that is, this advocacy?
Yes, well, I'm Juan Roman. I'm from Nicaragua, very far away from here. I'm a general practitioner, and I do identify as bisexual, so in the queer spectrum, and I have been part of a system that is broken, a healthcare system that is broken, and that is failing us, the queer community, as providers and as users, as end users. So I decided that I was done being part of a system and trying to identify what are the gaps and the cracks that needed a little bit of help. And then I moved to public health. I worked for 7 years as a general practitioner. I worked with political prisoners in Nicaragua, some of them from trans communities. I also worked with trans communities in prostitution in Nicaragua. In the States, I do a radio program which is intended to spread messages of improving health for starting with Hispanic community, undocumented Hispanic community, much of them which are also LGBTIQ+. And I've been doing this European public health and governance and leadership in European public health. Now I'm trying, I'm following a research on identifying the pathways to include LGBTIQ+ representation in public health policymaking.
Thank you. And then Sorab Roustayar, you identify as a trans Muslim with Afghan roots, as I read in your bio. You studied civil engineering at Delft University, but after your study, you have become more committed to helping refugees and fighting for their rights. You also fight racism and hatred to refugees, and you're the founder of the Fight Club, which is FITEQ Club. And it's a multidisciplinary platform operating from a queer, intersectional, and decolonial perspective. Is that all right? Yes.
That's all right.
This intersectional issue is very important for this platform, I understood. Can you explain a bit what that means or what that is?
Yeah, so intersectional is about actually the intersections of identities, because we are more than one identity. For example, I'm a trans person, I'm a person of color, I have a migrant background, I have a Muslim background, I have a refugee background. So you have layers of not only and of course from the social economical background you have. So these layers and not only vertically but also horizontally that we have, they intersect with each other. And when we talk about intersectionality, then we are talking about the intersections of identities, and therefore also oppressions of those identities in different ways. And if you approach this, then you don't take only one identity as seeing as one, but as a whole. And therefore your margin is not going to be like a tunnel vision of like, I'm going to serve only the gay community, the white gay cis community, but your margins are going to become broader, and therefore you can serve also more communities and be more into an inclusive and diverse format.
Do you come across within the queer community, across people who don't actually understand this, and I think they feel like it's a bit too far from their own identity issues when it comes to gays or lesbians, for instance?
Yeah, I think when I make a very distinct difference between queer community and LGBT community, because when we talk about queer community, then I perceive like then we are talking about people who are politically more aware and conscious about the systems that are playing around, and also the oppressions that are being submitted by the same system. And therefore you have more awareness and understanding about this ideology. I don't call people queer, or I don't see then the queerness in people if you're not aware of like what apartheid stat is about when it comes to Israel, Palestine, for example, or how oppression system works when it comes to police violence, for example, on black and brown bodies. Those are the things that are very important in intersectionality and also within the queer community. And I think for me, they're merged in one another. And to answer the question is, yes, there are people, because queerness has become more of a hype, so more people are claiming to be queer and wanting to be part of something, which I totally understand, and everybody has their own journey, and who am I to decide for someone who can identify as queer or not. But at the same time, because it's become a hype, it loses its meaning, and therefore the purpose of it, and therefore the whole political ideology, what is underlaying underneath it. And then you get that people don't understand intersectionality or using it if it comes, for example, a couple of years ago that a radical feminist stood up and they were transphobic. They were like TERFs. Now we call them TERFs, but they called themselves intersectional feminists, radical intersectional feminists, while they were forming such a high hatred against trans people because of their essentialistic ideology of the biology of how a woman's body should look like.
Charity, what is the cue for you in your community or in Maastricht community? Do you have an idea about that? Is it the same idea, that it has this political connotation?
I would say yes, because I also perceive intersectionality as a very important and very crucial part of being queer. I mean, in terms of as a white queer person, I have privilege of having one of my identities being just privilege, because I'm white, and basically by interacting with people, you can see, or at least personally I could see, that this experience is very, very different. And I think that to be LGBTQ means to also account that and to be aware of that, because it is a fact, and many times not thinking about it as an intersectional more divides us more and creates problems that further harm our cause. And if we want to achieve something, we need to do it together with understanding for each other issues.
In the historical perspective, do you see these same tendencies, that this togetherness makes it important, that people, the minorities, join hands together to actually fight for their rights? Jonas?
Well, I think the LGBT community has been conflicted ever since its first
acts. You see that in the very first meetings, women were sort of, you go and fetch the coffee, my dear, while us men discussed the main issues, so that there's that. But even within the gay community, you had men who wanted to lobby and gain their rights through politics, fraternizing with politicians, and you had groups who wanted to riot and wanted to paint parliaments, etc. And then you had a third group who just wanted to find a boyfriend during those meetings. And so you see that people have been joining that group for a number of reasons. But I do agree that even though those different backgrounds are there, that doesn't, we're always asking for people to be an ally and to be aware of the cause. So we should allow people to whatever their backgrounds is, to join or to be sympathetic, and I don't necessarily identify myself as queer because I don't really have the struggles that a lot of minority groups have nowadays. But I do think, and that's a personal opinion of mine, that the whole the whole idea of every letter and every group fighting for themselves is not doing the cause any good. I think I think that in a sort of way of being visible as a minority within the minority, I think we're having this divide and divide et impera sort of struggle. And I think we should, whilst everyone should be visible and free to fight for their cause, we should not forget the bigger part. I think that in my respects, or in my opinion, it has become a bit too much individualized nowadays. I think solidarity between minorities is the most successful way of reaching goals.
Is this also a strong issue in Nicaragua, maybe even stronger than in Western countries? Because there you still have many rights to fight for, and you probably have those groups fighting together. How is it in Nicaragua?
Yeah, exactly. And also, adding to that, I would say queer community, I don't think that they actually portray or recognize themselves as queer community. However, I do believe that it's queer community which are part of the LGBTIQ+ population in Nicaragua tend to fight for the rights of every Nicaraguan existing, because currently at the moment we're living in a dictatorship for 20 years now, and the LGBTI community has been in the front line of every fight, of every protest, of every human right preservation, because I think that these overlapping oppressions and just make it more visible and more tangible for a community to be, or in I don't think that this is I don't like the fact that we have to be resilient because we have to come from struggle, but the struggle has taught us, and the fights and all the oppressions have taught us how to fight and how to reclaim our rights. So I think that's one of the main issues that we have at the moment in Nicaragua.
I see you nodding, Sorab. Do you have anything to add to that? Maybe from your perspective, also working with refugees and.
Yeah, I think also when you look at individualism, what you see here in Europe, that's because it's the neoliberal capitalist system that is on divide and conquer. So what you see is that the system and the government likes to actually divide people in labels and in boxes. So there is walls between us, so we can't collaborate on each other. So everybody is screaming for recognition, for being heard, to be seen, while the power has always shown us that it's in numbers, and that's us, we as human beings, that if we banish all those walls, then it would be easier. And of course, when people are in circumstances as what you are explaining, in dictatorship, then of course there is more the intersections of this struggle is being more because you have also a common enemy. And now in the Netherlands or in Europe, most people are not aware or don't talk as a government as a common enemy, because it's like we are having actually a pretty good life comparison. But that makes it hard a little bit also because the label system is a neoliberal and capitalist ideology, and that has never brought us any time further, because also in the 70s has shown us that even when the divide actually came in within the women, the whole feminist movement broke down because the lesbians couldn't be part of it, the bisexual were not anymore part of it, the trans women were not part of it anymore, and then you had like this whole divide. And that is happening also in the past 5 years, also here in the Netherlands, 5-10 years, I would say, that I see that every group, like I'm part of a big alliance with 10 organizations, and we are based on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's 10 organizations. Well, which is good, because on one hand, I understand the struggle of that recognition, but it would be so much easier if we were to work together. And I think for me, queerness brings the values together, because it's about social political justice, it's about international solidarity, and it's about the core values that you carry with each other, so you get further and you look beyond the identities that you carry on. And then it's also, for the government, it's going to be more difficult to divide and conquer us, because we don't care anymore what's in our pants or what's under our clothing.
Coming to labels, when there's inequality, don't we need the labels to show where the inequality is? Don't you need to be outspoken about who you are and what you are and how you want to be to explain that you're in a position that's maybe different and you need more rights?
No, because you can't. So the whole ideology and typology about like what is gay, what is homosexuality. It has become on like making boxes on like people and putting typology about it, and to describe people, how they look, how they dress, where they go, and what they do. And then laws have been determined on that basis to actually exclude people from the society and to criminalize them and to kill them, basically, also in so many countries. And now we have 74 countries in the world that have been colonized, and 72 of them are carrying the same laws that Europe has actually implemented there. So when we look at labels, I don't think that you can destroy the master's house with their own tools. And that's not something what I invented, but I think that if you want to destroy a system, then you cannot rebuild it with the same system that they are like saying like, you're gay, so you're lesbian, and then some people were like, I don't identify with that, so I'm gonna carry on with more identities, more boxes, and then more divide and conquer, and the government and the system is like being happy about that, because the more we separate from each other, the more we cannot unite together to actually build it. And the recognition, I think, that doesn't come with identifying ourselves, but actually understanding where it started and how to dismantle it to actually become in a more core value of humanity and human rights.
So if I say Sohrab Rushdie identifies as a trans Muslim with Afghan roots, that is actually labeling you. And I think it's good in this sense that this is an issue we talk about tonight, and we want to show that.
Yeah, but I don't, like, for me, when I started to, like, when I am as, like, for people to identify me, so I give those terminologies, and I was like, so you can understand me. But when I look at myself and I want to see the system, I would draw myself from it, and I try to actually understand myself better by not labeling all those things and identifying myself with those terminologies. Because it frees me actually from all those chains, because all those terminologies have certain behaviors that I have to be, and being perceived as such by the system and by the society. and I have to live according those labels, and it's super tiring. So why would we do that?
You constantly then have to explain yourself, kind of.
Yes, and justify yourself.
Yeah. But that is difficult if society is not ready for you. Like, I just made the mistake with the wrong pronoun, and then again, Charity has to say, no, it's they.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you come across these issues, of course.
Yes.
Is that for you, Charity? Is that labeling? Is this an issue within the university also, for instance?
When it comes to dating, like many people, the problem is that certain just assigning she, her, him pronouns to people just based on the way present is so ingrained in many societies just because of the language that I see that even I myself, knowing that is the issue, I sometimes have trouble because it's been taught to me from a very young age that, yeah, this is how you navigate a word. And the point is here, it just requires wanting to sort of reprogram yourself, try and teach yourself how to be respectful. But I believe that labels in general are the tool, and basically they're a tool to describe certain kind of experience. And I think we need to obviously acknowledge the limitations that they might cause divide, they might cause people to feel like they have to live up to something if they pick a certain label. But at the end of the day, I believe the labels are just tools. Yes, they are imperfect. They help some people, and they don't help others. And I think we need to simply kind of acknowledge that they have limitations, and that certain labels can be understood in a broader sense or in a more narrower sense. And I believe that we sort of sometimes should leave interpretation of label to be more open to, like, I believe that there wouldn't be an issue, there wouldn't be a divider if kind of everyone could make it sort of their own. The same, I think, happens sort of with concept of masculinity and femininity, that they seem to be so rigid, society seems to demand of you to act certain way. And that's particularly why I prefer a label non-binary, because I don't want those restrictions. I absolutely understand that sometimes it's just the way it feels. But on the other hand, I believe that if we work on the expectations part, on simply separating the label from the expectation that it has to carry something, it demands behavior of you, and more use it as a tool of, hey, that was my experience, this is just to talk about your experience. It can be useful, but for now I believe that it may be a little bit tricky and I believe that sometimes they actually, as you mentioned, bring more harm than good by simply putting up expectations on you, because people see you more of a stereotype than actual person that just trying to somehow classify their experience because it's easier for them, it's easier for you to communicate with other people if you know that you share a bit of experience.
Jonas?
I'd like to add that in academia and in cultural sectors we're having the same discussion as well. A very particular example is in Flanders, we're going to introduce, much like in Netherlands, we're going to introduce a canon. So you have the canon van Nederland. We're going to have that in Flanders as well. In May, it's being introduced. And I was in the advisory board, and we were having a discussion whether or not one of the 50 frames should be devoted to LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ history, or whether we should introduce that theme into all the other frames. So whether you want to make it visible in one particular framework, or whether you want to include it throughout the frames, throughout history. And we had long, very intense discussions about that, and we ended up with, no, it needs to be made visible. We are going to make a particular frame for that particular topic, because otherwise you risk of being neglected whilst being incorporated in all those other frames. The same with exhibitions. In some museums, you have the question: is it still necessary to make exhibitions on female artists? Shouldn't they be included in collections and exhibitions everywhere? Should we make specific ones about them? And there, the answer too is, in my opinion, yes, because they are still underrepresented in museums and collections, so you need to make them visible. So I think in an ideal world, labels would be totally unnecessary, but in the world we live in, they can be a useful tool, as long as you understand that they are tools, in fact. But I think the visibility can be very useful in certain contexts in which this issue or this topic is very often forgotten or neglected. The aspect of making that visible through that tool is still very necessary, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Any questions or remarks on this concerning queer activism and these? Are there? Oh, sorry.
Hello. I want to mention Laurens Buys. There's a discussion about him. He works at the University of Amsterdam. He is homosexual. He believes in wokeness, but he has a problem with non-binarity. And now it seems that he get cancelled from the community at the university. Well, how do you think about that?
Do you know about this case? Sorab, you're nodding, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's about recognition. This person is a professor who has a high status in the society also, and that's different than like your neighbor not recognizing you, but someone in power giving this kind of lectures and saying that non-binary is an verzinsel. How do you say that in Dutch?
It's made up.
It's made up.
It cannot exist, actually.
And that actually, if you don't believe in non-binary, in like the experience of people of how they identify themselves, then it's the same actually for trans people. That he was like, I understand trans people, but I don't understand non-binary people. But I'm like, did you really understand the whole topic? Because if you don't understand one part of this spectrum, then you don't understand also the other parts of the spectrum. And person in a society in a high position as a professor who's lecturing science, then I think it's a dangerous position. And I think that this cancel culture that we have sometimes could be harsh, but it's also a time to wake up, because the society and the system has oppressed people for centuries, and people are talking back now, and so there is a backlash from the society and the people that's saying, and next generation, also a younger generation of 20 years, 18 years, who are much more aware of their identity and sexuality, and they're raising their voices about who they want to be and what they want to be. So yeah, I think it's legit.
Any other others know about this? No. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
If I'm allowed to react, I would say to this Laurens Buys that in the 60s, homosexuality was criminalized, and it would not have been accepted as something relevant. And so I cannot understand how someone who is homosexual cannot understand that they wanted to erase homosexuality in the past. And they wouldn't want to validate homosexuality. How can he forget that he is now erasing other identities that he does not understand? That is a very problematic issue, that a professor cannot incorporate a new concept of identity which he does not hold himself.
Yeah.
Do we find this back within the gay community, that they find it problematic that this alphabet has grown and that there's a lot of transgender issues? Pride, for instance, is an issue, I think, the gay pride in Amsterdam. Sorab, do you recognize that within the alphabet, there are groups who are having problem with this new issues, or well, not
yeah.
new, but
Yeah, I think when people are talking about like the growing of what they are actually, what people don't understand is that that we basically ask for human rights, and so for laws that is changing to make our lives actually easier to exist in this society. And I think when we look at the gay white society, when we look at laws, yes, some laws have been changed, but who's actually benefiting from it? It's high class white homos and lesbians people who are benefiting from adoption, marrying, buying a house, or whatsoever. But trans people, when I mean, like, we had just a few months ago that the government gave an excuse about the whole mutilation of trans people. And then in the Netherlands, we think that we are very far when it comes to rights. But if we look at the history, then actually it's not so far. And if we look at marginalized positions, if we look at refugees, the position of refugees in camps who are being trans, undocumented people, brown and black people, like transitioning. There is a whole monopoly in the Netherlands when it comes to transition. So people are crowdfunding or going into foreign countries to fulfill their transitions. And if people are raising their voices about it, it's not because we want to, because it's so exhausting also. It's about human rights. It's about, for me, it's not about visibility. It's also not, it's more about representation, but most of all, for me, it's far more beyond important if laws are being implemented the way that we can exist in this society without fighting for our existence.
Charity, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I also believe that currently entire trans community is sort of was made to be an outlier, because it's easy to notice that someone who doesn't look like they were supposed to, in metaphorical quotes, wear a dress, just to try to make themselves feel okay. And it's just easy to make trans community into a scapegoat and forget by the fact that trans women of color were the ones who were at the lead of fighting for queer rights in America and in USA. But essentially that trans community hasn't so much, because sometimes we just had to for existence. In the US currently, the laws that are being passed is basically taking away hormone replacement therapy, and is basically a genocide at this point, because they're trying to pass a law that will allow CPS, Child Protective Services, to take away children from parents who accept their kids as they are and help them in the transition, just because these kids are trans, and just to get them to families that wouldn't accept them. And that's primary reason why trans community has the highest suicide rates amongst the queer community. We are just most visible and most vulnerable. That's why it's sometimes easier to make us a scapegoat. And usually, the problem with just letting people make out a scapegoat out of certain parts of queer community is that you will always have that outer part, and it will slowly move into more privileged areas. Just because someone accepts you for now because there is someone else to blame doesn't mean that they're going to accept you when the people that they perceive as an issue are dealt with, I would say, like that. So that's my opinion on this, that basically at this point we need to, right now in queer activism, we need to just simply stand up for the trans community, just because yes, we are the target and vulnerable part, but vulnerable part can't be just discarded and just thrown to the wolves. It needs to be protected, because it's also a very important part of the queer community.
we have this noise now about societies being endangered by these transitions in the gay community, or is that indeed the same kind of scapegoat theory that you can put onto it as an historian? Do you see these tendencies now, like in Republican states in the United States?
Well, I would first like to add on the previous subject, it won't come as a big surprise coming from a historian, but I think this is a plea for more historical knowledge. If we're talking about a gay man who can't comprehend another minority, and pride being degraded into some sort of commercial bank holiday, for instance, I think that goes to show that people need historical knowledge, and people need to realize where we come from and how very brief in history this period of relative tolerance is, and how those rights acquired for a certain part of that community has also been in regulation for a number of decades. It's very hard fought over, and that should create empathy, I think, for groups that still need to fight and still aren't acknowledged and recognized. Yeah, I think if you look at the current situation, some historical knowledge could certainly benefit, because what you've been saying is about those Republican states using scapegoats and minorities. It's something, unfortunately, it's part of the condition humaine, part of being human, that whenever you're being confronted with difficulties, whether as an individual or as a society, you tend to look for scapegoats, you tend to look for minorities, you tend to look at people that you can blame for your own bad luck. And even in other cases as well, I've briefly discussed witchcraft. I often talk with my students and discuss that how can people, rational, intelligent people, actually believe in the fact that women fly to devils, etc. If you read those trials, if you read those documents, it's very often a very personal drama that's on the basis of that. People losing their child and saying that, oh, this old lady in the village has killed my child. They're mourning people who want to see the death of their child explained. So I think it's very basic human behavior to find scapegoats. I don't think that it will be so easy to eradicate that behavior or that reflex, but looking at those periods in history can make us more empathetic and more human beings towards one another. Also in that very pride context, realizing that only a few decades ago, perhaps the nowadays white privileged gay males that are partying on their boats and flaunting their six-packs and whatever, were on the same, were part of that same scapegoating minority a few decades ago. So I think history can provide us with a lot of lessons in current society as well.
Yeah. Also, if we look at the situation in Russia, where gay people and trans people
Putin
are
is exactly
demonized
doing
as being influenced by Western.
Putin is doing what medieval rulers were doing. The moment economic sanctions were launched against Russia, even before the war, the invasion of the Crimean region, first thing he did was implement anti-LGBTQ laws and saying, well, this is a Western invention. We don't want this over here in Russia. We are pure. We don't know what that is, basically. It's something from the West, and it's launched to corrupt us as a society. That's medieval discourse. I talked about that whole floods and famines being sent to people. When Conchita Wurst won the Eurovision Song Contest, 2 days afterwards there was a huge flood in the Balkan region. There were a number of bishops saying, well, this is a punishment of God because that singer won the Eurovision Song Contest. That's something we still do, looking for scapegoats and looking for divine retaliation. You had a number of rabbis and priests and Islam preachers who claimed that the coronavirus was a punishment of God because we as a society are so tolerant towards the LGBTQ community. So you see that this scapegoating is not something from the past, it's still present within society.
I was at the conference of the Transgender Europe community in Berlin last year, and they said that the anti-gender gender ideology lobby has 3.6 billion euros in a year to lobby against gender issues, and that we as a LGBTIQ+ community only have 1.2 billion. And when I look at ILGA Europe, they state that it was the Vatican who started the gender ideology narrative to counter the LGBTIQ+ movement. So it's not accidental, it's not something small or random. And it also in Latin America, the anti-gender movement is already there for 10 years. They almost stopped a peace accord in Colombia because there were too much paragraphs about LGBTI reparation of damage that they had suffered in war. And it's also in Eastern Europe also very widespread. So it's far from incidental and random.
Just an adding to this discussion, yeah. Back there.
Thank you. Hi, first of all, thank you for being here and sharing your vulnerability and perspective. I have a philosophical question and I struggle to find the answer, so I'm curious to hear yours. Generally I find separation and polarization a very difficult and dangerous thing in terms of, feeling threatened, fighting against each other, not being open to listen. And at the same time, and it was triggered by your comments around intersectionality, for instance, the more we share, like the more similarities we have, the more we move into dialogue. But then also, you kind of start dismissing maybe the reasons how you're different, right? And that requires some dedicated attention and new laws and changes in society, etc. So I guess my question for you all, or whoever wants to pick this up, is how do you drive change that's meaningful for people that really are currently not experiencing the human rights in the same way that they should, while moving into dialogue that's effective and drives quick change, right? That you're kind of preventing that fighting or threatening or like struggles. I hope that made sense. But I feel like this unity, separation, polarization, labeling, like those terms, how do you combine those to actually really drive change for the better? Thank you.
Juan is nodding, but maybe you don't have an answer yet.
I don't have an answer yet, and I'm not an expert, but I do know that one of the first steps into this is the recognition of our identities and the recognition of all of our identity descriptors, as you were mentioning, the migrant, the black, brown, the living in a fat body, all of these descriptors of our identities, and recognizing them and being able to visualize them and to find representation of them within policy-making structures and the laws passing. Because, for example, when we take a look at, I work in health, well, I'm studying in healthcare, in public health, and we have to look at health impact assessments. And the very first, like the base of the pyramid is all of the social factors. That includes the social determinants of health, gender, race, ethnicity, color. And we have to, the first thing that we need to do for this is to engage in the communities that have the local knowledge, that have the local expertise. And that I think that changing the perspective in policy making by gathering that data from the communities themselves is what helps us to build this unified community that's going to be thriving and living the best lives. And also I think that even running cost utility analysis is very important, because dismissing our identities and gender, sexual orientation and gender identity efforts to change conversion and quote-unquote conversion therapy. In the US, for example, that costs $9 billion a year. And while affirmative care, meaning psychosocial support for people to accept their identity, to work this path through, actually makes the government earn $1 billion a year. So it's even a win, and we're avoiding a loss, an economical loss, if we want to look into what makes the world run, which is the money. Like dismissing our identities is actually making the people lose money. And I think that's one of the points that are very important to touch upon as well.
Yeah. The more aspects to that, Sohab, you.
Yeah, thank
maybe
you.
Maybe in answering
this
this
question.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree. And no, I wanted to elaborate from. I wanted to add things maybe. I think before we can unite, we have to recognize the differences, because if we start like collaborating, the organization Fight Club, what I'm running is a hybrid space. So it's like white folks with mixed with BIPOC people, black, brown people, indigenous people of color. But in order to do that, and if the white people are not seeing their racism and they're like telling me like, I don't see color, then we are fucked, because we can't move anywhere. Because if you don't see the oppression systems and the way you have been raised, that your skin has a superior thought and you are superior to, in comparison with other parts of the world, then you cannot make that change. So I think, first of all, and that's what you see, is that people of color want to unite in their own safe spaces. Brave spaces are being created where people can just breathe and organize with themselves. And I think you can move on past that if we recognize that certain systems of racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, transphobia, ableism, etc., exist, and that people cannot participate in societies.
And do we need some radical action to make this visible, or should we try and keep this dialogue open and not polarize too much?
I think it's an end. At first, I was like this person who was like knocking on doors, and I was like, yeah, fuck the system, fuck patriarchy. And then I was like, okay, wait a minute, you need different strategies. So you need that, but you need also dialogue, because some people find it very the perceiving of like radical activism, which is like basically fighting for human rights, is not working. So then you need dialogue. So I think we need all the strategies that are amongst us, forming this kind of things, but having protests also, going to the ministries and having lobby system organizations to do this, to make sure that the system changes. But like I said, I don't believe in this system, and I don't believe that you can run this system in a better way, because it's always about profit above and not about human beings.
Charity, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I absolutely wanted to add that I also believe that if we want to unite, we have to understand each other's backgrounds. We have to understand the differences, and that's also part of why intersectionality is important, because it is not just trying to divide us, but by saying, oh, you're different, you're different, you're different. Or it's not like you only can cooperate with someone if you are almost the same person because you're so similar. It's just basically learning how other people's experience works, just so we can come up with a solution that acknowledges problems that we all have, that acknowledges different perspectives, different approaches towards a problem. Because in experience of one person, because some people have more experience in certain areas, others have in else, and same as if you're, I don't know, group of scientists trying to solve a problem and you have different backgrounds in different areas, if you have different areas and expertise, each person will bring something from their expertise to show you how they would solve their problem. And same with, I think, social backgrounds, that sometimes you wouldn't even know that other person runs into a problem, or you will not acknowledge it unless you talk to that person, unless you try to understand it. And I believe that the primary thing that should drive the change and willingness to change is that understanding of people that are different from you. Because yes, sometimes they've been painted as scary, as different, but if you start talking, if you start befriending those people, trying to see those different viewpoints as for what they are, different viewpoints, and trying to see the differences not in dividing way, but in a way of, yeah, we're just different and how we can make it work. This is the way forward, in my opinion. Like, we need to have that in order to make something that works for everyone.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, why is the fight for recognition in the LGBTQ community and that fight for freedom, why is it a fight for us, like for everyone?
This is about, having the opportunity to have your own identity, I guess, and that's an issue.
I think none of us is free until we are all free. So my freedom is actually connected to your freedom and to the people around you and all of us. So as long as you are suffering, I will be also suffering in a different way. And what unites us is to understand and recognize those differences, because your struggle is totally different than mine. And but it's not, I don't agree with what was said just now, because I don't think it's about understanding, because I don't totally understand where you've come from, and you would not understand my whole transition in this society as a person of color. But it's not about understanding, it's about recognition of the differences that we have, and find then the solution in what binds us and what is and connects us to make that change happen for both of us.
And this connection is the freedom, you said?
Yeah, it's the freedom. It's like, for me, I think it's the 99 against the 1%, and we are all the 99% in this society, because we are all being exploited when it comes to labor, for example. That we are all being exploited, of course, in different ways. But if we want to free ourselves, then we have to unite ourselves. But I think the first step for me, in my opinion, is the recognition of the differences that we have.
Okay. Any last questions? All the way upstairs. Can you shout it out? We can try and repeat it. So the question of the historical perspective, why are minorities then, in this case, the scapegoat? Or
I think it's just the rational thing to do. You won't pick on a very important or powerful group, and I think it's something that unites the majority. Majorities are seldom united. You're going to elections tomorrow, I guess. That's tomorrow. I think if you would raise hands, you aren't united. You're all going to vote for different parties. You all have different views on society. You all have different senses of humor. You all have different preferences. Some people like pepper on some. We are all divided. But if you have a minority that you can demonize, that you can talk about, that is one way of uniting, and it works in several contexts. It's very useful to find a minority to blame for something. It's the migrants' faults, it's the Socialist Party's fault, it's the transgenders' fault. In my own country, it's the French-speaking part's fault. It's something that is it's very popular, but you won't. It's something that when that majority feels that they are losing control over a situation, it's very easy to pick a minority. It's much more difficult to, as a minority, to pick on the majority. It's you need that whole what I showed as well. You need the cultural framework. You need those printing presses. You need those illustrated Bibles, etc. So it's a sociological, anthropological way of uniting the majority that is seldomly united as a society. I hope that's some explanation. That minority can change throughout history. I've shown some medieval examples. I think the most known historic example is the Shoah, the Holocaust, where once again a minority is being used for political benefits to create a sense of unity. It's throughout human history.
And that's actually a scary thing, that there's a thin line and all of a sudden things can change and a minority is the scapegoat. I think because of that, it is very important that we talk about these issues. So I want to thank you very much, Charity, Jonas, and Juan, for participating and indeed sharing your vulnerability and these issues and your views on the issue. I forgot to say we had a slide at the beginning concerning a research done at psychology. Katja, are you still here? So you can explain a little bit about it? Because I wanted to find back the slide, but maybe you can tell what you're looking for. You're looking for students to participate in the research, right?
We're conducting a study right now on cognitive reappraisal in gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals. So that's the population we're looking for. It's a really short online survey. It takes like 15 to 20 minutes, and it pays you €5 if you want to participate. I will also hand out flyers outside, so take one and you can scan the QR code and just participate there. Thank you.
So she'll be at the door to give you more information if you want to participate. I want to thank you and again the panel. Thank you very much.